There are many tools and strategies that we can use to help us manage the national park. One of the main overarching strategies is the management plan. So every national park in Victoria has its own management plan. Ours is called the Greater Alpine National Park Management Plan and was finalised in 2016. It was put together over a 5-year period and involves significant consultation with a range of people and a range of groups, including advisory groups, expert panels, the scientific community, and input from the general public. All of this input and feedback is collated to consider all of the needs of the park, such as conservation and preservation of the plants and animals, protection of cultural sites, research opportunities, and for recreational activities. It is then signed off by the Minister for the Environment on behalf of the Victorian Government. So the government is accountable for the delivery of this management plan. And it's a key document to help us make decisions about how to manage the park. Some of the strategies within the plan are zonings and overlays. And then in terms of developing and implementing operational level strategies, we work those down into a project. Zoning is where we section the park off into smaller areas and apply different management priorities or strategies in each of these zones. These management priorities include things such as environmental protection, recreation and visitor use, facility development, and research. The zones that we have in the park at the moment are the conservation zone, which is our area of high natural value and has high value communities in there, such as alpine bogs or habitat for rare and threatened species. The conservation and recreation zone is an area where the emphasis is on protection of environmental values, but can allow for some recreation. We have a recreation development zone, which are areas which allow for recreation and for some levels of facility development. We have a wilderness zone, which these are proclaimed under some different legislation and are reasonably high value environmental areas and protected from infrastructure and facilities, but allow for recreation of a passive nature. And we have reference areas, which are areas that we try not to have any human interference. That's kept to a minimal, and we allow those areas to exist in their most natural form. We've also got overlays within the plan, which provide us with greater detail of the activities within certain areas of the national park. So you can see here on the left of the slide that the visitor experience area of the Mount Bogong is highlighted here, and it talks about some of the activities that can and can't happen in the Mount Bogong area, and it gives a general description of what we expect to happen in the Mount Bogong area. There's further detail on these activities in each overlay and in each zone within the management plan in table 8.3, which is on page 124. So that then brings us to the project level. So this is where we take the guidance from the management plan, the zones and the overlays, and we implement projects at an operational level to manage the national park. So the way we do this in general is we determine what the asset is that we're trying to protect. So for example, in an environmental context, we would look at an asset being the Barramus or the mountain pygmy possum. So that's a highly threatened species and is predated upon by foxes or wild dogs. And so therefore, because of its high level of protection, that's the asset that we're trying to protect, and therefore we implement a strategy to try and protect it. The second component of that process is once we've worked out where the asset is and what the asset is, mountain pygmy possum, we work out whether it has got threats that are impacting upon it. So yep, we have determined that the mountain pygmy possum has foxes as a threat. And then is that having an impact? So research tells us that foxes can have an impact on the populations of mountain pygmy possum, and scientific research over the last 20 or 30 years has given us that evidence. So once we've understood those three elements of what's happening in the park, we then look at how we are going to manage them. So we develop a project to manage them. So in this case, we would develop a fox baiting project in areas where we know we've got mountain pygmy possum habitat, such as around Mount Mackay or at Mount Jim, where we know we've got mountain pygmy possum habitat. We know they're being predated upon by foxes, and so we look at how do we get rid of those foxes. So we develop a project of baiting or trapping foxes in that area. So then we prioritize out of all of the projects and all of the assets and the needs of the park, we work out which is the highest level of asset to protect and which is under the most threat. And so in this instance, the mountain pygmy possum is a highly threatened, highly endangered species because of its numbers and its susceptibility to foxes. So it gets a reasonably high priority. So it gets allocated a certain amount of money and resources and staff time to be able to deliver that project. So in this case, we have a fox baiting project, which is managed by our staff and delivered by contractors, and they bait. There's 50 to 80 baiting stations around the Bogong High Plains to protect the mountain pygmy possum. Another one of our key assets in the Bogong High Plains and Mount Bogong area is the mountain pygmy possum. So the mountain pygmy possum is one of Australia's smallest possums. It's a marsupial, breeds live young, and it lives in the alpine and subalpine areas of southeastern Australia in isolated populations. So its population's estimated to be around 2,500 in all of Australia. So because of its status, it is listed under the Federal Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, that's the EPBC Act. It's listed as endangered, and under the Victorian Flora Fauna Guarantee Act, the FFG Act, it's also listed as endangered. And there is an international list as well. It's the IUCN Red List, and the mountain pygmy possum is listed as critically endangered on that as well. The IUCN Red List is the list that has things like giant panda listed on it. So because of those listings and the legislative responsibility of us to protect the pygmy possum, it gets a fairly good mention within the management plan. So there's a strategy within the management plan on page 47 which talks about the need for us to control the threats to the mountain pygmy possum. So there are several threats to the mountain pygmy possum, such as habitat loss and fragmentation, the predation by foxes and cats, and climate change. So the strategy in the management plan talks mainly about controlling the fox and cat populations to protect the mountain pygmy possum. So that's one element of what we do to make sure that we fulfill our obligations under the legislation to protect the mountain pygmy possum. The management plan also sets out some zones and overlays for further protection for the pygmy possum, such as the remote natural area overlay, which covers a fair bit of the range of where the possum's habitat is. And it also exists within the conservation zone. So there's some protection mechanisms there as well to allow for protection of the possum. So what does that mean for us on the ground? That means that we then, because of those legislative obligations and the listing of that animal as a endangered species, we then have an obligation to undertake actions to protect it. So there's actually a national recovery plan for the mountain pygmy possum, which is worth looking up because it's got a lot more detail about these particular topics. So for us on the ground, we've identified that we have an asset that is valuable and needs protecting. We've also identified that there is a threat to that asset in habitat loss and foxes and cats and so forth. So therefore we need to work out what to do next. So we get through that process, we get some funding to implement fox and cat control programs. So that's what we do on the ground. That's when it becomes project level. So we do things like we do a baiting program where we hire contractors to bury baits in the areas where the mountain pygmy possums live, and these baits are buried to a depth that only foxes or dogs can smell, and so foxes and dogs dig these baits up, and that is a way of getting rid of the foxes. We also do cat trapping at the moment and a little bit of spotlighting to see what other predators are around for the possum. In terms of the climate change, so the impact there is quite different, I suppose. What we're seeing is a couple of things are happening. We're seeing that one of the major food sources for the mountain pygmy possum, which are bogong moths, we're seeing the bogong moth decline in numbers significantly in the past couple of years, and that's likely due to a number of factors. One is that there's a extensive and ongoing drought in central Australia, which is where the moths begin their life. So because of the drought, we're not getting as many moths coming up from central Australia. They're also becoming distracted by the amount of light that is on the pathway, on their migration pathway to the Bogong High Plains. So they're going into cities rather than coming up to the high plains. And also some of the areas where the moths start their life are becoming impacted by farming practices such as chemical use or landscape clearing. So because the lack of that as which is a major food source for the possum, the lack of migration of the moths as a result of climate change and some other factors means that there's less of that food available for the moths on the high plains. So what that's meant is that we've started to, in consultation with Zoos Victoria and a few other organisations, we've started to feed the pygmy possums. So we've literally been out onto the high plains with a food source that has been made up by Zoos Victoria, and we are putting that out as a food source for the possums in areas where the pygmy possums live. So it's another management action where we can try and make sure that we do have survival of that threatened species. Another management issue we have are sandbar deer. So we know that established populations of sandbar deer are widespread throughout the Alpine National Park. And if we follow the process that we've been talking about, the asset, threat, impact, and then management options, the asset we have in the Bogong High Plains and within the Alpine National Park are peatlands or alpine wetlands, and also the quality of our water, and also rare plants and rare plant communities. So these are all listed in the Flora Fauna Guarantee Act, the FFG. There's several rare plants listed in the Act, and alpine wetlands are also listed as a plant community. And alpine wetlands or peatlands are also listed under the Federal Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation, or the EPBC Act, as well as a endangered or threatened plant community. And obviously the quality of water is also an asset that we're trying to protect. So we know that there are assets there. We know that there is a threat there. So the threat is sandbar deer. So these are hard-hooved animals that aren't native to the area. They cause compaction and pugging and vegetation decline
they can impact on water quality as well. They're an introduced species. So they have also been listed in the FFG Act, but as a threatening process. So they've been recognised in the legislation as having an impact in the park, and particularly on those peatland areas. So we know there's an asset to protect. We know that there is a threat. Are they having an impact? Well, the FFG Act has listed them as having an impact. From our observation and from camera monitoring, we can see that they are having an impact. And so the next thing to do is to put in place a management strategy. So within the management plan, it does refer to sandbar deer, and that we should be controlling sandbar deer, particularly in our high value areas like the Bogong High Plains. So we therefore developed a project to manage and protect the alpine peatlands by controlling or trying to remove sandbar deer. So we have programs and have had for a number of years where we are removing deer via shooting programs, either ground shooting or aerial shooting. We have professionals as well as volunteer shooters to do this for us. So previous to the shooting program, we also wanted to understand the value or benefit of doing this. So we've set up a range of monitoring remote cameras in the park. So prior to the shooting program started, we could monitor and gauge how many deer were moving in and out of these remote cameras, and also the quality of the peatlands via the cameras. And during the course of the program and into the future, we'll continue to monitor the deer numbers via the remote cameras, and also via survey work on the peatlands themselves to see if their health is improving due to our management actions. Of course, there are other impacts on alpine peatlands, not just deer, so that's another factor that we need to think about, such as feral horses. So we'll be looking at those into the future as well.
One of the ways we can understand the impact on our environment is through research projects, and one of the research projects happening at the moment is regarding the impact of climate change on the alpine environment. And this project is called the ITEX experiment, and that stands for the International Tundra Experiment. So this is an international long-term research project which is looking at the impacts of global warming on alpine and tundra environments. And it's been running for about 30 years, and it runs across 11 countries. And in Australia there are several sites and several universities who are involved in this project. There are 2 sites on the Bogong High Plains. The research project involves setting up small circular shaped greenhouses about 1 metre in diameter and about ½ metre high with an open top, as you can see in the picture. These chambers are meant to simulate an increase in warming in their immediate area, and there are 25 or so of these chambers in small grids at a couple of places on the high plains. So they're meant to simulate what global warming would be like within that chamber by increasing the temperature by 2 to 3 degrees. And then the research partners are looking at what happens inside that chamber in terms of the plants and the animals, and the grasses and the vegetation inside the chamber, to see how that changes with the increase in temperature. So does it flower earlier? Does it flower later? Does it die off? To give us an understanding of what will happen under a climate change scenario. So the next step, once we understand what happens to vegetation, is then to try and work out what management options we might have available to us. And there may not be many, there may be lots we don't know yet. So there's a lot more detail of the ITEX experiments online, and you can see the research partners or the universities' information up there on the websites.